Hey folks, welcome back to a discussion on Solaris 11 operating system. In the Solaris 11 administration playlist on the YouTube, we have managed to discuss a number of facilities in Solaris 11. In this segment, we'll take a look at the Solaris 11 zones. Before we get into the actual commands that we employ to configure, install and use a zone, we're trying to understand why there was a need for a facility such as zones. If you look at the traditional way the applications used to be managed, we had individual machine for each of the application that we may have in our data center. As you can see from the conceptual diagram here, there is a dedicated machine 1 for say a web server. There's a dedicated machine 2 for an application such as database, and there is a separate hardware host name of machine 3 that we have used for application server. This used to be the case in a data center, but with the muscle power of machines improving year after year, we now have access to machines with a lot of RAM, with more powerful CPUs, such that we can accommodate more than one applications in an individual box. So as you can see, our hardware has the potential to host many a number of applications inside it. But the problem then would be granular control over these applications. For example, if I am a web server administrator, I might want to have full control over the machine where my web server is running, which cannot be the case if I have multiple applications running on the system. Similarly, a database administrator might require root access to the machine where the database is running, but on the same machine we have two other applications also running, so it would obviously be a risk if we give root access to the database administrators alone. On top of all this, there might be conflicting requirements for these applications. Just as an example, I know it's a crude example, but just to make the point clear, let's assume that an application like web server requires the telnet service to be enabled, whereas an application like an application server requires the telnet service to be disabled. So one requires the telnet service to be enabled, other requires the telnet service to be disabled. Such kind of conflicting requirements makes it difficult to have multiple applications hosted on a single physical box. So on one hand, we would like to make complete use of the big muscle power boxes we have access to, optimal use of it by having multiple applications installed on the same box. On the other hand, we also require isolation. We want to make sure that the applications that we install on the same box are isolated from each other, and the administrator of each of these applications gets full control over the machine where these applications are installed. Which is when in Solaris 10 operating system the concept of zone was introduced. With Solaris zones, you could create multiple instances of the same operating system on a single physical box. So I could have a Solaris 10 or 11 operating system installed on a single physical box, and then within that operating system I could have multiple instances of the operating system running. So remember, we only have one kernel here, but we would have multiple instances of the operating system running on the same OS. This way we have isolation. Each zone has its own root user, each zone has its own IP address, so I could treat each zone like a separate instance of the operating system. So the database administrator can now access zone B, and whenever required he or she could just reboot the system. Zone A and zone C would be unaffected by that operation that he performs or she performs on zone B. So an operating system level virtualization is what we achieve by using zones. Of course, the performance is as good as running these three applications on a single box, because since we are not introducing any additional layer like the other supervisors or hypervisors do, the performance, whatever degradation that we otherwise have in virtualization technology, that is negligible in the case of Solaris 11 zones. So that's what we would see in this segment. We have a Solaris 11 operating system instance already running on our virtual box. What we will do is to create zones inside that operating system. Each of the zone would be regarded as a separate instance of the OS, and I could have root access to each of the zone and install applications of my choice within that. Most of the applications that run on Solaris 11 are currently certified to run on Solaris 11 zones as well. So let's get back to the virtual box here. I'm going to do an SSH to a server which we have installed using the text-based installation of Solaris 11. So let me go inside that machine first. Let me log in and issue as root user. So we now have become the root of the Solaris 11 machine. Maybe before we get into the configuration of zone and installation of the zone, we try and figure out how many zones are currently running on the system. So I can do that by running the command zone adm list -cv. As you can see, there is only one zone, which is actually the global zone that has an ID 0, and the brand of that zone is Solaris, and it uses a shared IP type. We'll discuss about what shared IP type and exclusive IP type at a later stage, but currently if you look at the output of zone adm list -cv, I get to see there is one zone that's running, which is the global zone. And that's exactly what you get after you install the Solaris 11 operating system. After you complete the installation of Solaris 11 operating system, you literally install a global zone. So whether you perform an explicit configuration or not, you complete the installation of Solaris 11, what you get as a result of that is a zone by the name global zone. So currently we don't have any non-global zone or the zones running on Solaris 11. It's only the global zone, that's the actual OS running on our machine. Maybe we would decrease the size of the font so that you would be able to see the output clearly. Size to 14, so that way this would be much clearer. So zone adm list -cv. The good news is that there are only two commands you are expected to remember when it comes to zone configuration and administration. That's one, of course, is zone adm, which is what you get to see right here on my screen, and the other one is a command called zone cfg, which is what you would use to configure a zone. For getting clarity on a few things, I'm going to open another tab and SSH to the server where we are going to configure a zone. Occasionally we might want to monitor a few activities on this terminal. So let me here again issue to root user and stay as a root user. So remember, I have two tabs on my terminal, both tabs connected to the same machine, which is S11-server. So we observe that we don't have any zone running. It's only the global zone that is currently running on my Solaris 11 machine. Before I start configuring the zone, I want to go inside a directory called /etc zones. We'll try to understand what are the various files that exist under the /etc zones directory. One of the important files, of course, just you might want to keep a note of the different files that you get to see under /etc zones. One of the important configuration files is sys-solaris.xml. Let's find out what is there inside sys-solaris.xml. So let me go ahead and look at sys-solaris.xml and see what is there inside. Every time we create a zone, one of these templates are used while configuring the zone, meaning when I configure a zone in my Solaris 11, this particular template is going to be used to set a zone path. So if I do not specifically set a zone path while configuring a zone, it's going to pick up the zone path from this template. Similarly, if I do not set the property auto boot is equal to true while I configure the zone, it's going to pick up auto boot as false because that's how it is defined in this template. Similarly, for every zone you configure, net 0 physical port is going to be assigned, from which a virtual network card is going to be created automatically. So if you do not want the net 0 to be assigned as a network port to the zone you're configuring, you will have to explicitly remove that while configuring the zone. Otherwise, it's going to pick it up from the template that you get to see here. So I'm showing you a file which is in fact a template that's going to be referred during the zone configuration. So when I configure a zone in Solaris 11, this template is picked up automatically and the properties of these templates are set to the zone that you're configuring. In case if you do not want any of these properties to be set, you have to either explicitly remove it or override the values of the properties while you configure the zone. So keep in mind the different files that exist under the etc zones. Maybe you can keep a count of the number of files that you get to see here, because this directory is going to be modified while we configuring a zone. So keep in mind this particular template, sys-solaris.xml. That's a template that's a template which will be used while configuring a zone. Just to take the discussion to conclusion, there's another template, as you can see here, which is sys-solaris10.xml, a template that you would be using in case if you're configuring a zone that runs Solaris 10 operating system. So if you want to migrate your Solaris 10 machines, existing Solaris 10 machines with its application, there is a way to do that. You can create an archive of your Solaris 10 machine with applications running in it and configure that as a Solaris 10 zone in a Solaris 11 machine. And while you do that, this is the template that's going to be referred. Anyway, that's for a separate discussion if we get some time. For now, we'll focus on a Solaris 11 zone, which is nothing but the same version as that of the native Solaris 11 operating system on which we are running. So just to quickly recap where we stand, we used a command called zoneadm list -cv to find out the zones that are currently running. We were not able to see any zones, only the global zone is running, which is something you get as a result of the installation of Solaris 11 operating system. We are now looking at a directory called etc zones, where there are a number of templates that are used while you configure a zone. One of the templates that's of interest to us immediately is sys-solaris.xml, which is the default template used if you are configuring a Solaris 11 zone. And I hope it's clear now that the values from this template is picked up while you're configuring a zone. If you don't want these values to be a part of the configuration, you have to explicitly remove it, or you will have to modify the value. When I say modify the value, I hope it's clear that, as an example, if there is a property called auto boot and the value of property is set to false by default in the template, and you want your zone to use a different value such as true, then you will have to set it explicitly, otherwise it picks it up from the template there. So having understood that during the zone configuration it picks up some of the values from the templates, let's now go ahead and look at a few other things. We will add a user, for example, user add let's say John, and we will verify that etc password has a user by the name John because we just created it. That's one of the modifications I'm doing on the etc password of my host machine, by the way. Maybe we will also make other modification. There is /etc default console as an example, or maybe etc ftpd ftp users. These are the list of users who are denied the FTP access, and as you can see, the root user is denied FTP access, but I'm removing the root user from the list, giving root user FTP access to this machine. All I wanted to do here is I'm modifying the default configuration files. I'm modifying the default files that I get as a result of fresh installation. I added a new user by the name John, as a result of which the etc password file was updated. Then I modified another system file called etc ftpd ftp users, removed the root user from that list of users who denied the FTP access, So two of the system configuration files have been modified on the host operating system. That is another change I made. Again, we observed etc zones directory, we looked at the templates that exist in there, then we modified two system files. I'm also looking at IP-ADM show-addr. There is only one IP address assigned to one of the physical ports, which is net0. Net0 is the only physical port from this machine that's being used. So you can see that it's assigned an IP address which is 192.168.0.100. Maybe before we go ahead, I just wanted to verify one more thing. Sys-solaris.xml file. There is a property called IP-type exclusive. Now, there are two values for the property IP-type. One is exclusive, the other one is shared. These are the two possible values for the property IP-type. Now, exclusive, as the name indicates, gives the zone exclusive access to a specific port from the global zone. When I say global zone, I'm talking about the host Solaris 11 operating system. If the IP-type property of a zone is set to exclusive, which is default, of course. The reason I say default is because when you configure a zone, it's going to pick up these parameters from the template, and the template is showing the IP-type value to be exclusive. So when I configure a zone, unless I specify IP-type is equal to shared, it's going to set to a value exclusive, because that's how it is in the template. So the zone is going to get an exclusive access to the port. Now, with the network virtualization in Solaris 11 operating system, we can afford to give exclusive ports to a zone. If we go back or rewind ourselves back to the days of Solaris 10 operating system, we may have had only 4 ports on a host operating system, and there is no way we could create virtual NICs on those 4 ports in Solaris 10. Because of that constraint, the IP-type property of a zone was set to shared by default in Solaris 10. But with the luxury of creating VNICs, being able to create VNICs on the physical ports in Solaris 11, the default value for the IP-type property of a zone is set to exclusive. I can give an exclusive port to the zone. That port will not be shared with anyone else, including the global zone. That's what that IP-type is equal to exclusive means. That's the default in Solaris 11. It used to be shared. The value of IP-type used to be shared in the Solaris 10 operating system, because Solaris 10 operating system did not have network virtualization feature. In the previous segment, when we discussed about Solaris 11 networking, we closed the part 2 of the Solaris 11 networking segment with an introduction of creating the VNICs from the physical port. And because of that feature in Solaris 11, we can now afford to give exclusive ports to the zones that we create. So in a way, the network virtualization facility introduced in Solaris 11 has taken the OS virtualization, that is zone, to the next level. I think we dragged that discussion a bit, so let me give you a quick recap of where we stand. We are trying to virtualize the operating system. We are trying to create new instances of the operating system in Solaris 11 in the form of zones. We don't have any zone running on the system. We verified that by using the zone ADM command. We looked at the etc zones directory where you have templates. The templates would be referred during the configuration of the zone. It's going to happen automatically. It's going to pick up values from that template. A couple of values we looked at was auto boot set to a value of false and IP-type set to a value of exclusive. If you want a different value for the zone that you're configuring, you're going to explicitly set that value. Otherwise, the value would be of that of the template. We also saw that net0 as a port was assigned in the template. So every zone you configure, you will have that net0 port assigned automatically, because that's there in the template. If you don't want that port to be assigned, you can take that out once you configure the zone or during the configuration of the zone there. We created or we modified a couple of system configuration file, one by adding a user in the etc password file, and the other one was we removed the root user entry from etc ftpd ftp users. etc ftpd ftp users is a file which has a list of users who are denied the FTP access. We modified a couple of system configuration files on the host operating system or the global zone. That's all I wanted to point out there. So now that we have looked at these properties and we looked at the IP address also, let's start configuring a zone. First we will look at the zones that are currently available. That's global zone. It has an ID of 0. Let's configure the zone. Remember, I mentioned to you that there are only two commands, main commands, that are related to zones. One is a zone ADM command for administration of the zone, and the other one is a zone CFG command for configuring the zone. Now let's go ahead and configure a zone. The command is zone CFG -z. Give it a name. Let's call it as zone A and hit enter. You can see that it gives me a message that says use create to begin configuring a new zone. Remember, the zone A does not exist on the system, as you can see from the output above. So the command itself is asking me, we are in an interactive mode here, it's asking me to type the create command to create a zone. So let's go ahead and do that. I do create. You can also see that it's actually picking up the configuration from a default template called sysdefault. I think I wrongly mentioned it as Solaris, the template that's going to be used while configuring this particular zone as sysdefault. Maybe we can take a look at that. That's the advantage of having another terminal opened on the same box. If I look at sysdefault, let's look at sysdefault.xml. It's not going to be too different from syssolaris.xml. As you can see, auto boot is false, the brand is Solaris, IP-type is exclusive, not shared, and again net0 is added automatically as a part of your zone configuration. So that's the template being used while I configuring the zone. Remember, I am in the zone configuration command mode. So I'm creating it. Let me set a zone path. I would do a zone path here. From Solaris 11 onwards, every zone would have ZFS as its root file system. Just like Solaris 11 root file system is on our pool, every zone that you create will have a root file system, of course. Every zone you create has a root file system, which we call as a zone path. That also has to reside on an ZFS file system. So what I'll do now is maybe I'll create a file system by the name rpool/zones. Remember, we already had a discussion around the ZFS file system in one of the segments in Solaris 11 administration playlist. So we are creating a file system called rpool/zones, and maybe I will set a mount point for that in the form of /zones. I'll say rpool/zones. Maybe I would list it zpool ZFS list. This will list all the ZFS file systems. The file system that is of interest to us is right here. The data set is rpool/zones. That's mounted under /zones directory. That's what we would use as a zone path. So /zones/zone A is where I want the zone A zones root file system. Okay. Again, please take a look at the ZFS file system here. I have /zones mount point mounting rpool/zones, but I don't have the mount point /zones/zone A. In fact, I don't even have a directory called /zone A. So let's see what happens. I've given that as a zone path here. Once we complete the configuration of the zone and start the installation of the zone, we will figure out what happens to that. So that is done. We have set a zone path, which also happens to be the root file system of the zone A that we are configuring now. The other thing I want to do is to, let's say, add net. I want to add a network port. I would say I want to set physical net1. I want to assign a network port for this zone. Remember, IP type, the global property IP type is exclusive. So now that I have assigned net1 to the zone A, net1 is going to be exclusively a port that belongs to zone A. Net 1 is not going to be used by global zone. You will not be able to assign net 1 to any other zone because zone A gets exclusive right to the net 1 port. It need not be a physical port. I could actually go ahead and create a VNIC on top of the net 1 and assign the VNIC instead of assigning the physical port net 1. I say end. If you keep high availability in your mind, you might want to add one more physical port to the zone and configure IPMP from within the zone. We discussed IPMP and other high availability options in networking in the previous segment, but currently, since we are only discussing about zones and the basics of zones, we are not worried really about the high availability of the network component inside the zone. Remember, there is a default network port that's assigned to the zone. We will remove that later. Maybe we will complete the configuration of the zone and we will run the zone CFG command again to remove it. If I go back to the etc zones and look at the sys default template that's being used during the configuration of the zone, this is the port I'm referring to. This port is now getting added to the zone because it's a part of the template there. So that's done. What you need to probably want to focus here is this specific section of the zone configuration. Now, if you understand this specific section of the zone configuration, everything about the zone configuration is going to be very, very easy. At the end of the day, a zone is a virtual instance of an operating system. An operating system will have a network port, operating system would have file system, operating system would have access to let's say a CD-ROM. So you basically start assigning or specific amount of memory, specific number of CPUs. That's what you give to each zone you configure in Solaris 11 operating system. The pattern to add resources to the zones, resources such as file system, resources such as memory, resource such as CPU, the pattern for adding these resources is going to be the exact same as you see on the highlighted section here. I would say add a resource. In this case, the resource is a network port, so we say add net. If it was a file system, it would have been add fs, and then you are within the scope of that specific resource. As you can see, I am now within the scope of network. Whatever I do here are attributes of that specific resource. I have an attribute called physical, which is actually an attribute of the resource called network. And the value of that physical will point to a network port. It could be a physical network port or it could be a VNIC. Similarly, if I had used add fs here, which is add a file system, I would have gotten inside the scope of the file system resource. It would have been fs here, and then I would have set attributes of the file system, such as what is the block device file name, what's a raw device file name, what's a mount point that I want that file system to be mounted. We will see examples of that as we progress through the discussion, but what I would request you to please keep this in mind, that by and large a good part of our zone configuration is about adding and removing resources in zones. Of course, you can do it on the fly or you can do it with your zone shut down. We will take a look at either of that scenarios, but this is the crux of it. As long as you're able to see and understand this pattern, I think everything about zone is going to be a cakewalk. So here we are restricting our resources only to networking. I'm not adding a file system, I'm not adding CPU, I'm not adding memory, I'm just adding a physical network port, and I've added net1. I can say set auto boot is equal to true. Remember, the template has set the auto boot at false, meaning your zone will not boot when your actual host boots up. You will have to manually boot the zone by running the zone ADM command. But if I set the auto boot property of the zone to true, then zone will also boot when your host or the system boots up. So these are bare minimum properties I'm setting here. You will be spending a lot of time on the zone CFG command if you are configuring zones for serious purpose, like on a production system. Of course, it's not the network resource alone that you would manage. There are many things that you would manage. So here we have taken only the example of a network resource. I can verify if my configuration is correct by running the command verify. and if I am happy with the configuration, remember these are basic configuration, I can say I can say exit, I'm out of it. Of course, exit would also save the configuration there. So now that I have configured a zone, there are a few things I would like to observe. One, of course, is I am inside the etc zones directory. Let me do an ls and see any change inside the directory. One change I can observe is that there is a dedicated XML file for the zone A. Maybe I can take a look at it. I say zone a.xml. These are the values that we gave while configuring the zone by using the zone cfg command. As you can see, name of the zone, something we gave, zone path, something that we gave. We changed the auto boot value to true. I say we changed it because the template uses a value false. If I had not specifically mentioned auto boot is equal to true, it would have picked up the value false from the template. IP-type we did not give specifically, but it picked up from the template. It's exclusive, that means the network port net1 is going to be used only by zone A. You cannot use it for any other zone, or not even for global zone for that matter. This is something that's picked up from the template. We will remove it, we don't need it. So that's something we're going to do. Again, you might be tempted to open this file using your favorite editors like VI and remove this by using the dd command, but I would strongly encourage you to please take a look at the first line in the file that says do not hand edit this file. Of course, that makes it even more tempting to hand edit this file and modify the file by hand, but the recommended way of modifying the entries in this file is by using the zone cfg command. So let's try that. I run the zone cfg command again on the zone A. Remember, this time it's not giving me instruction to run the create command to create a zone, because it knows that there is a zone by the name zone A. I'm going to remove the net. So I would say remove, it's not add, it's actually remove a net, automatic network. That's the name of the resource I'm removing. And then I say let's say link name is equal to net0. Okay, and if I say exit, it will automatically save the configuration of the zone. And now let's do a cat zone a.xml. You can see that the configuration about net0, this entire section has vanished from the zone a.xml because we have removed that resource by using the zone cfg command. Again, I hope you remember this particular section in the file came because it was there in the template. We have managed to remove net0 because we don't need net0 to be a port on the zone A. We have added an exclusive port in the form of net1 on the zone. So that part is done. Again, if I run the command zone adm list minus, this time around I don't want to use CV. CV is the option I used earlier. I would say IV. It is still not showing me zone A because I stands for installed zones, installed and running, of course. The zone that we configured, which is zone A, is only in configured state. It is not installed. So if I look at minus CV though, I would be, minus CV though, I would be able to see my new zone listed in there. Of course, it doesn't have an ID yet. ID would be assigned to the zone when the zone starts, and you can also see the status of the zone to be configured. It is not installed or it's not running, so I haven't installed it yet. And IP-type is exclusive. That means whatever network port I've assigned to the zone, that's going to be exclusively given to the zone A there. So we have our zone in configured state. Now the next step, of course, is to install the zone. Before I do that, I just wanted to show you ZFS list command again. This is the data set of our interest, rpool/zones, that's mounted under /zones mount point. Look at the entire output. We don't have any directory under /zones as a mount point in the output. This is something you might want to keep in mind because when we install the zone, the picture is going to be slightly different from what you currently see. So now that we have our zone configured, let's go ahead and install it. Remember, from Solaris 11 onwards, for zone installation, you need access to the repository, image packaging system repository. Again, if you're not familiar with IPS or image packaging system, that's a new packaging scheme in Solaris 11. I'd strongly encourage you to please watch segments in the Solaris 11 administration playlist that talks about image packaging system and how you can configure a Solaris to contact a repository to download and install the packages, or how you can set up your own repository. These are discussed earlier, but the point to keep in mind is that to install Zone in Solaris 11, you need access to the image packaging system repository. We have configured image packaging system repository for our system, so we can directly go ahead and start the installation of the Zone. The command that I would use to install the Zone is zonadm -zzone a install. So as you can see, a new file system has been created, a ZFS file system. So immediately if I go back to the ZFS list command, you can now see that there is a new mount point /zones/zone a created specifically for the zone that we are configuring. We can go back to you can see the repository, the IPS repository that I have is actually 192.168.0.100. So the Zone installation has managed to reach out to this repository to download the package and start installing the packages. And while the installation is underway, we might want to look at list -cv again. You can see the status has now changed from configured state to incomplete state. This is actually a state of transition. When a zone transitions from configured state to installed state, or from installed state to configured state when we uninstall, the state of the zone is going to show as incomplete. That's what you get to see. Once you complete the installation of the zone, this is going to change to complete. So let's wait for the zone installation to complete. It's going to take some time, so I'm going to pause the video so that you don't get bored looking at the installation, and then I'm going to come back to you immediately after the installation of the zone is through. So as you can see, the download is completed, and it's in fact installing those packages which will eventually become our zone. So let's wait for the installation also to take place. Depending on the speed of the network and the amount of RAM that you've assigned to the virtual machine that runs Solaris 11, this process might take a longer time than you'd expect. So please have patience to see through the entire process to have our first zone up and running if you're doing it alongside me. So the installation of the zone A is through. By the time you watch this video, I would have edited a good portion of this installation so that you don't get bored looking at the whole progress of the installation of the zone. So now that the installation of zone A is through, we can probably take a look at the -cv option of zonadm list command and see that the zone A is in installed state. This time around, if I use the -iv option, it's again going to list me zone A because zone A is now in installed state. So we configured the zone by using the zone cfg command. We have an XML file called zone a.xml under etc zones directory for this particular zone that has all the properties like the network port assigned to it, the name of the zone path, etc. Once we installed, we got to know that a new ZFS file system has been created, which is mounted under /zones/zone A. That file system is going to be the root file system of the new zone that we have just installed. And now is the time to boot the zone. We will boot the zone by using the command zonadm -zzone a boot. And while I do that, I might want to run the command list -cv to exactly observe the changes that it goes through. So when I say boot and go back and look at the option here, you can actually see there is a transitional state called ready. Ready is a state that a zone goes to from installed before it hits the running state. So by the time I hit the command now, you can see my new zone is in a running state there. So my zone A is booted. Let me verify the status of the zone here. Zone A is in running state. You can see that ID has been assigned to zone A. The ID is 1. Except for global zone, no other zone would have a constant ID. A zone is going to be known by its name and not by its ID. If I reboot the zone A, it's probably going to get a new ID than zone than one that you see right now. So we have zone A running. It has an ID. There is a daemon that might be of interest to us by the name zone ADMD, whose responsibility is to boot a zone, mount its file system, plumb its IP address, and whatnot. So you can see that there is a zone ADMD daemon specifically for zone A. So you'll have, if there is a second zone running on my system, there would be another zone ADMD daemon that's responsible for the second zone that would be running on my system. So zone ADMD is responsible for booting the zone, assigning it an ID, assigning an IP address to the zone, mounting its file system, etc., etc. So you'll have a zone ADMD daemon for each of the zone that's running on your system. Since this is our first login, I mean, there are so many things that we haven't set for zone A, such as its root password, whether the naming service should be enabled for NIS, NIS plus, or DNS, the IP address to be configured for the net1 interface that we have assigned to zone A. So none of this is done. We have to go through the system identification phase for zone, just like we go through the system identification phase for operating system installation, Solaris 11 operating system installation. So first time when we log into zone A, we will have to capture its console. So let's do that by running the command zlogin minus capital C zone A. So if you're going to access the console of zone A, you get this screen here. Depending on how fast you get into the console, you might actually see other messages like the SMF files getting imported to its repository, just the way we see that immediately after the installation of Solaris 11. So I can use escape 2 to go through it. Computer name is actually the host name of my zone. It need not be same as a zone name, so I can just give a different name, my zone, that happens to be the host name of the zone. Whether I want to configure my network, I say yes and proceed. It asks me for the IP address 192.168.0.104 maybe. These are the screens that you are very familiar with if you have installed Solaris 11 operating system. Every zone being a separate OS instance also needs the system identification details. So I don't want to configure a DNS, I'll proceed with that. I don't want a name service, maybe I'll choose Asia. I would go with India. Asia Kolkata is fine. No default language. It's asking me for the root password. Again, you would remember from the text-based installation of Solaris 11 OS, if I just give a root password and do not create a user, root will be a direct account. I don't need to log in as a simple user and SU to root. Root will not be a role account if I skip the second section of this screen. So I'm going to give it a password here for the root user and go proceed with that, and that will complete my system identification phase for the zone. It will go through a reboot, and it's actually booting the zone up with its host name, my zone, that I just gave. It's giving me console access. I can log in as root. Remember, I can log in as a root because I did not give the user details. If I had given the user details during the system identification phase, I would have had to log in using that. I would have had to log in using that user ID and then SU to root. Let me supply the password here. I am inside the zone. So let me set the display is equal to VT100 export display. Let me see if I can clear it now. Sorry, that was the right command there. So I've cleared the screen. Now if I look at IPADM show -addr, I can see that the new IP address that I assigned during the system identification is in effect here. uh, I can type the zone name command to find out the name of my zone, uh, but if I run pwd, this is the root file system, and let's say list users, I don't get to see the user I created on the global zone there. I can actually see the etc password file. You will not see the user I created in the global zone. It's a fresh file that you get inside the non-global zone. Similarly, if I look at etc ftp users, remember we had removed the root user from the global zone file, but this is a separate file, so you get a fresh etc ftp users here. Again, other important things include svcs ssh. It's online here. Maybe what I'll do is I am on the global zone svcs ssh. Remember we spoke about conflicts that an application has while running on the same host, but here your global zone has a separate SSH service and your non-global zone has a separate SSH service. So here if I run zone name, this is my global zone, I can go inside the zone, which is where I am now, and say svcadm disable SSH, svcs SSH, it's disabled. But if I go back to the global zone and look at SSH, it's still online. So I get granular control in managing even the service management facility services from within the zone. So imagine a second zone that I create, it can have the SSH enabled, install the application that requires SSH, and on this zone I can have the SSH disabled and install the application that requires SSH to be disabled. So with this, we have come to a conclusion on configuring and installing a Zimble zone in Solaris 11 operating system. We haven't discussed about resource management in Solaris 11 zones. We will do that in the next segment on Solaris 11 administration. I would exit out of it, and in case if you want to come out of this console, it's tilde dot, that's the combination I use to come out of that console connectivity there. And before I close this discussion, I think it's important we know how to shut down the zone. Zone adm list minus cv, it's running. Zone adm minus z zone a shutdown is a command I can use to shut down the zone. Let's wait for the zone to shut down. Now if I look at zone adm list minus cv, it's actually has gone back to installed state. So thanks for watching this segment. Hopefully we can catch up again soon with the further discussion around Solaris 11 zones.